The crisp October air nipped at my face as I drove down Maple Grove Road, my hands gripping the steering wheel a bit tighter than necessary. After 3 years away, the familiar route to Winchester Estate felt both welcoming and strange. The trees lining the private driveway had grown taller, their leaves painting the sky in brilliant shades of amber and crimson. My old home stood exactly as I remembered it, a gorgeous Victorian mansion that had been in our family for generations. I pulled up to the circular driveway, killing the engine of my Mercedes, but remaining in the driver's seat for a moment longer. The house seemed to watch me through its many-paned windows, waiting. I'd achieved everything I'd set out to do in New York, making partner at Wilson and Brooks law firm by 32, building a reputation that preceded me in every courtroom in Manhattan. Yet coming home felt like admitting defeat. Ms. Winchester? Thomas, our elderly groundskeeper, appeared at my car window. His weathered face broke into a warm smile, the same one that had greeted me every day throughout my childhood. "Welcome home, Miss Elizabeth." I stepped out of the car, breathing in the familiar scent of freshly cut grass and late-blooming roses. "It's good to see you, Thomas." The grounds look beautiful as ever. "Your father insisted we keep everything exactly as you left it." He hesitated, then added, "Though there have been some changes inside." Of course there had been changes. That's why I was here, wasn't it? My sister Catherine's temporary stay in my wing of the house had somehow stretched into months, then years. The same sister who'd spent her 20s bouncing between failed art galleries and underground music venues, while I'd worked myself to exhaustion building a real career. The grand porch creaked softly under my heels as I climbed the steps. The sound transported me back to countless summer evenings spent reading on the white wooden swing, dreaming of the life I'd built for myself. Now that dream had materialized into corner offices and designer suits, but the cost had been steep. I hadn't spoken to Catherine in over 2 years, not since that explosive Christmas dinner when she'd announced she was finding herself in my private study. My key still worked in the heavy oak door, at least they hadn't changed the locks. The foyer opened up before me, its marble floors gleaming in the afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows. Everything was immaculate, yet somehow different. A modern art piece hung where my mother's beloved Monet print had been. Catherine's influence, no doubt. I ran my hand along the mahogany banister as I climbed the curved staircase. Family portraits lined the wall, generations of Winchesters looking down with varying degrees of approval or judgment. There was my graduation photo from Yale Law, my parents' wedding picture, and a new addition, Catherine in a bohemian dress, paint-splattered and grinning in what was clearly my private studio. The second-floor hallway stretched out before me, its thick carpet muffling my steps. I passed the library where I'd spent countless hours preparing for the bar exam. The door to my father's study was closed, as always. Finally, I reached my wing of the house, or what used to be my wing. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. The walls, once a sophisticated slate gray, had been painted a warm terracotta. Artwork covered every surface, most of it Catherine's distinctive style, bold, chaotic, beautiful in its own way, but completely at odds with the house's traditional character. My carefully curated furniture arrangement had been disrupted, pieces moved to accommodate easels and clay sculptures in various stages of completion. I pushed open the door to my study, my sanctuary, and stopped short. The room had been transformed into an artist's studio. My mahogany desk had been pushed against the wall, its surface cluttered with paint tubes and brushes. The law books I'd left behind were stacked haphazardly in corners, making room for canvases and art supplies. The air smelled of linseed oil and turpentine instead of leather and old paper. Standing in the middle of this creative chaos, I felt something snap inside me. This room had been my refuge since I was a teenager, the place where I'd built my dreams piece by piece. Now it felt like a stranger's space, every corner filled with evidence of my sister's casual appropriation of my life's work. I sank into my old leather chair, at least that remained unchanged, and tried to gather my thoughts. The autumn sun was setting outside the bay window, casting long shadows across the floor. In the distance, I could hear the faint sound of classical music drifting up from the conservatory. Mother must be at her piano, playing Chopin as she always did when she was worried. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably Richard, my colleague back in New York, wondering if I'd arrived safely. I let it go to voicemail. The real world could wait a few more minutes while I processed the reality of what I'd come home to. The mansion had always been more than just a house to me. It represented everything I'd worked for, every sacrifice I'd made to become the person I am today. As twilight deepened outside, I remained in my chair, watching the room grow darker. The paintings on the walls took on strange shapes in the dimness, like accusations made visible. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. Voices murmured downstairs, my parents, probably discussing my arrival. Soon enough, I'd have to go down and face them, have the conversation we'd been avoiding for months. But for now, I sat in what used to be my study, surrounded by the physical evidence of how easily a life could be overwritten. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 6, its deep chimes echoing through the house just as they had throughout my childhood. Some things, at least, remained constant. I straightened my spine and stood up. I hadn't fought my way to the top of New York's most cutthroat law firm by backing down from a challenge. This was still my home, my legacy, and I intended to reclaim it, one room at a time. The next morning, I woke early to the sound of songbirds outside my window. I'd forgotten how noisy country mornings could be compared to Manhattan's steady hum. I'd spent the night in one of the guest rooms, unable to face the thought of sleeping in my old bedroom, which Catherine had undoubtedly redecorated as well. The morning light streamed through the gauzy curtains as I pulled on my running clothes, determined to maintain at least this part of my normal routine. The grounds were peaceful at dawn. My shoes crunched along the gravel path that circled the estate as I tried to clear my head. Thomas was already up, tending to the rose garden my mother had always been so proud of. He gave me a small wave as I passed, his eyes holding a hint of sympathy that made me run faster. When I returned to the house, sweaty and slightly more centered, I found my mother in the kitchen. Margaret Winchester stood at the massive granite island, arranging fresh-cut flowers in a crystal vase. She looked exactly as I remembered, perfectly coiffed silver hair, pearl earrings, designer casual wear that probably cost more than most people's formal attire. "Elizabeth, darling," she said, not looking up from her flowers. "I thought I heard you come in last night. There's coffee in the pot. Your father's already in his study." Of course he was. William Winchester had spent every morning of his life in that study since inheriting the firm from his own father 30 years ago. Some things never changed, even if everything else had. "Thanks, Mom." I poured myself a cup, noting that they still kept my favorite brand. "I think we need to talk about Catherine." My mother's hand stilled on the stems she was arranging. "Your sister is doing wonderfully, you know. Her last exhibition at the Bradley Gallery was quite successful. Mrs. Carmichael, you remember her, don't you? From the country club? Bought 3 pieces. That's not what I meant." I took a careful sip of my coffee. "Why is she living in my wing of the house?" "Oh, Elizabeth." My mother sighed, finally looking at me. "You've been gone for 3 years. The house was sitting empty except for holidays. Catherine needed a stable environment to focus on her art, and your father and I thought." "Thought what? That my success meant I didn't need my home anymore? That Catherine deserved a reward for finally finding something she could stick with for more than 6 months. That's unfair." My mother's voice took on the stern tone I remembered from childhood scoldings. "Your sister has grown tremendously. She's finding her path, just as you found yours." "I found my path through hard work and dedication," I said, setting my cup down harder than necessary. "Not by appropriating someone else's space." "Is that what this is about? Space?" My mother shook her head. "This house has 27 rooms, Elizabeth. Surely you can share." Before I could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Catherine appeared in the doorway, looking like she'd just rolled out of bed, paint-stained yoga pants, oversized sweater, dark hair piled messily on top of her head. She stopped short when she saw me. "Lizzie," she said, using the childhood nickname I'd always hated. "You're really here." I thought I heard voices. "Catherine." I kept my voice neutral, professional, the same tone I used with difficult clients. "You're looking artistic." She laughed, the same carefree laugh that had always made me feel somehow uptight in comparison. "And you're looking very lawyer LY. New York treating you well? Well enough that I can afford my own place. Unlike some people." "Elizabeth." My mother's sharp tone cut through the tension. "That's enough. Catherine, darling, have some coffee." Elizabeth was just telling me about her firm. "No, Mother, I wasn't." I turned to face my sister directly. "I was asking why my wing of the house has been turned into an art commune." Catherine's expression shifted from casual amusement to something harder. "Is that what this is about? You flew all the way from New York to complain about room assignments." "They're not room assignments. It's my home, my inheritance." "Ah, yes, the precious inheritance." Catherine moved to the coffee pot, her movements deliberately slow. "Because you're the responsible one, the successful one, the one who followed in Daddy's footsteps. Never mind that some of us might have other talents, other dreams. Dreams don't pay mortgages, Catherine. Success takes work. And what do you think I've been doing?" She spun to face me, coffee forgotten. "Just because I'm not billing hours at some soulless corporate firm doesn't mean I'm not working. My art matters. It speaks to people. It speaks to Mrs. Carmichael at the country club," I couldn't help saying. "How revolutionary." The hurt that flashed across my sister's face made me regret the words immediately, but I couldn't take them back. This was the pattern we'd fallen into since childhood. Me, the practical older sister, always measuring success in concrete terms. Catherine, the free spirit, believing that passion was enough to justify any choice. "Girls." My mother's voice was tired. "Please, can we not do this?" "Elizabeth, you've only just gotten home. Catherine, your sister has a right to feel concerned about changes to her space." "Her space?" Catherine's laugh was bitter now. "She abandoned this place. 3 years, Lizzie. You barely called, barely visited. You were too busy becoming the next legal star to remember you had a family. So yes, I moved into your wing. I made it into something beautiful, something alive. And now you swan back in here like some prodigal daughter, expecting everything to be exactly as you left it." Her words hit home harder than I wanted to admit. Had I abandoned them? I'd been building my career, making a name for myself. Wasn't that what I was supposed to do? What Dad had always pushed me to do? The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the antique clock on the wall. Outside, a gardener's mower started up, the distant buzz providing a soundtrack to our standoff. My mother had gone back to arranging her flowers, though her hands weren't quite steady. "I need to shower," I said finally, my lawyer's instincts telling me to retreat and regroup. "We can discuss this later." "Of course we can," Catherine called after me as I left. "We can discuss it tomorrow, or next week, or in another 3 years when you remember we exist." I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The morning sun caught the dust motes dancing in the air, making them look like floating stars. In the hallway, those family portraits seemed to watch me with new judgment. There was a photo I hadn't noticed last night, Catherine and me as children, sitting on the porch swing, my arm around her shoulders as we laughed at something long forgotten. When had things changed? When had success and responsibility become walls instead of bridges? I stood in the hallway between my wing and the main house, feeling the weight of expectations, both met and unmet, pressing down on me. The mansion suddenly felt too big and too small all at once, its walls containing too many memories and too many unspoken words. After my confrontation with Catherine in the kitchen, I spent the afternoon in my father's study, neutral territory, catching up on work emails. The familiar smell of leather and pipe tobacco helped calm my nerves, even though Dad hadn't smoked in years. I was deep in a brief for a corporate merger when Martha, our housekeeper since I was 10, knocked on the door. "Miss Elizabeth?" This just came by courier. She handed me a thick cream-colored envelope bearing the Goldman and Associates logo, our family's longtime banking institution. Mr. Thomas signed for it earlier, but he only just brought it in. "Thank you, Martha." I took the envelope, noting its weight. "Has my father seen this?" "No, miss. It's addressed specifically to you." She hesitated at the door. "Would you like some tea? You've barely eaten today." I managed a small smile. I'm fine, but thanks. Martha had always tried to feed me during stressful times, going back to my law school exam periods. Once she left, I examined the envelope more closely. Goldman and Associates handled all of Winchester Estates' finances, including the trust funds that both Catherine and I had received on our 25th birthdays. Mine had gone straight into investment accounts. Catherine's had funded her series of artistic ventures. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, several pages of account statements, and what appeared to be legal documents. The letterhead bore today's date and was signed by James Goldman himself. Never a good sign when the bank's president gets personally involved. "Dear Ms. Winchester," I read aloud, my lawyer's instincts already picking up on the formal tone. "It is my duty to inform you of certain irregularities that have recently come to light regarding the Winchester Estate Trust and associated accounts." The words that followed hit me like physical blows. According to the documents, a series of complex financial maneuvers had been executed over the past 2 years. Transfers, loans, and investments that had slowly but surely eroded the estate's financial foundation. Most alarming were the multiple liens against the property itself, using the mansion as collateral for increasingly risky ventures. My father's signature appeared on some of the documents, but others. I leaned closer, my legal training kicking in. Some of the signatures looked wrong, slightly off in a way that made my stomach clench. I spread the papers across Dad's desk, creating a timeline of transactions that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. "This can't be right," I muttered, reaching for my phone. But before I could dial Goldman's number, another detail caught my eye. Several of the most recent transactions were tied to a familiar name, Bradley Gallery. Catherine's Gallery. The same one my mother had been bragging about this morning. The room suddenly felt too warm. I loosened my collar, trying to think clearly. The numbers swam before my eyes, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions when all tallied together. The estate's financial cushion, built up over generations, had been quietly hemorrhaging money into a black hole of bad investments and gallery expenses. A knock at the door made me jump. "Come in," I called, quickly gathering the papers. My father stood in the doorway, looking older than I remembered. His silver hair was thinner, the lines around his eyes deeper. "Elizabeth, I thought I might find you here." His eyes fell on the papers in my hands, and something flickered across his face. I see James kept his word about notifying you promptly." "Dad?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears. "What's going on?" "These documents." He closed the door behind him and sank into one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "It's complicated, Elizabeth. The market hasn't been kind these past few years, and certain investments." He trailed off, looking around the study as if seeing it for the first time. "These aren't just bad investments," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "There are signatures here that look forged. And the Bradley Gallery. Do you know how much money has been funneled into Catherine's art ventures? Your sister has real talent," he said defensively. "She just needed support to get established. The gallery is showing promise." "Promise?" I stood up, papers clutched in my hand. "Dad, the estate is leveraged to the hilt. The mansion itself is at risk. Did you even read these contracts before signing them?" A flush crept up his neck, the same tell he'd had when I was a child and caught him in a lie. Some of the details may have escaped my attention. "I've been distracted lately." Distracted? The word tasted bitter. Or deliberately looking the other way while Catherine burned through our family's legacy? It's not that simple. He stood up, some of his old authority creeping back into his voice. "You've been gone, Elizabeth. You don't understand the pressures, the obligations." "I understand numbers," I cut in, my professional calm finally cracking. "I understand contract law and financial fraud. These transactions, they're not just risky, Dad. Some of them might be illegal." The word hung in the air between us. My father, the man who had taught me everything I knew about law and ethics, wouldn't meet my eyes. "Does Mom know?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "Your mother, she sees what she wants to see. Catherine's success in the art world, the gallery opening, the social connections. She doesn't look too closely at the cost." I sank back into my chair, suddenly exhausted. Outside, The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the study's oak-paneled walls. Family photos watched us from their frames, generations of Winchesters who had built and preserved this legacy, now potentially undone by misplaced trust and willful blindness. "There's more," my father said after a long moment. "The bank, they're calling in some of the loans. They want proof of the gallery's viability, documentation of its earnings." He paused. "James Goldman gave us 30 days to provide it, or they'll begin foreclosure proceedings." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, its sound somehow mournful in the growing darkness. I looked down at the papers in my hands, papers that threatened everything I'd thought was secure, everything I'd come home to reclaim. "Why didn't you call me?" I asked finally. "When things started going wrong, why didn't you reach out?" "Pride, maybe." He smiled sadly. "Or shame. You were doing so well in New York, making a name for yourself. I didn't want to burden you with our problems." "Our problems," I repeated. "They're my problems now too, aren't they? That's why Goldman sent me these directly. They're expecting me to fix this." My father didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. I gathered the papers carefully, my mind already starting to work the problem like a complex legal case. I'd need to review every transaction, trace every dollar, find out exactly how deep this financial hole went. "Don't tell Catherine," Dad said as I stood to leave. "Or your mother." "Not yet. Let me figure out how to break it to them." I finished for him. "Fine, but we're going to have a longer conversation about this tomorrow. I need to know everything." As I left the study, the weight of the papers in my hands felt like lead. The familiar corridors of Winchester Estate suddenly seemed fragile, as if the bank's threats had already begun to make the walls transparent. Somewhere in the house, I could hear Catherine's music playing, one of her artistic inspiration sessions, no doubt. I wondered if she had any idea what her dreams had really cost us. I spent most of the night in the guest room, surrounded by spreadsheets and bank statements, my laptop casting a blue glow across the bed. Each transaction I traced led to another, creating a web of financial decisions that made my head spin. By dawn, my eyes were burning and my notes covered several legal paths, but I had a clearer picture of what we were facing, and it wasn't good. The early morning light was just creeping through the windows when I heard movement in the hallway. Catherine's footsteps, heading to her studio, my old study. I'd learned her routine quickly, early morning painting sessions when the light was best. Making a decision, I pulled on a sweater and followed her. I found her setting up an easel, her dark hair tied back with a paint-stained scarf. She looked up as I entered, surprise flickering across her face. "Lizzie? You're up early. Didn't sleep much." I closed the door behind me, noting how she tensed at the sound. "We need to talk about the Bradley Gallery." "What about it?" She turned back to her canvas, but I caught the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged her brushes. "Did you know Dad was taking out loans to fund it? Using the mansion as collateral?" The brush she was holding clattered to the floor. "He said he was investing, supporting my work." She bent to retrieve the brush, not meeting my eyes. "The gallery's doing well. Mrs. Carmichael just bought 3 pieces, I know." I moved closer, picking up one of her recent paintings, an abstract swirl of blues and golds that probably meant something to someone. "But the gallery's expenses far outweigh its income. Did you ever actually look at the books?" "That's not my job," she said defensively. "Mark handles the financial side." "Mark?" I set the painting down carefully. "Mark Bradley? The gallery owner." Catherine nodded, finally turning to face me. "He knows the art world. He has connections, contacts. He's helping me build my brand." "Your brand?" I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. "And did your brand need a new wing of the gallery? Or the extensive renovations? Or the promotional events that cost more than most people's yearly salary?" "You don't understand the art world," she shot back. "You can't build a reputation without investing in it." Mark says a lot of things, apparently." I pulled out my phone, where I'd saved some key documents, including convincing Dad to sign over power of attorney for certain accounts. "Did you know about that?" The color drained from her face. "What are you talking about?" I showed her the documents, watching as she scrolled through them with increasingly shaky hands. The gallery isn't just failing, Catherine. It's a money pit. And some of these transactions, they don't add up. Where did the money from the Peterson showing go? The tax records show a significant sale, but there's no corresponding deposit. Mark handles all that, she whispered, but I could see doubt creeping into her eyes. He wouldn't. He's not. A con artist? I took my phone back. Maybe not intentionally. But he's burning through our family's money like it's unlimited. And now the bank wants answers. Catherine sank onto her paint-splattered stool, looking suddenly young and vulnerable. I just wanted to make something of myself, she said softly. Like you did. Everyone always talked about your success, your achievements. Why can't you be more like Elizabeth? Elizabeth always knows what she wants. I needed to prove I could succeed too. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the tears in her eyes, making them sparkle. For a moment, I saw us as children again, Catherine crying over a broken toy, me trying to fix it while telling her everything would be okay. But we weren't children anymore, and I couldn't fix this with kind words and big sister promises. The bank is giving us 30 days, I said, keeping my voice gentle but firm. After that, they'll start foreclosure proceedings. On everything, the mansion, the gallery, all of it. 30 days? She looked around the studio wildly, as if seeing it for the first time. But my show? I have a major showing scheduled next month. Mark says it could be my breakthrough. Catherine. I waited until she looked at me. Mark says a lot of things. But the numbers don't lie. And these numbers? I gestured to my phone. They're telling a very concerning story. She stood up abruptly, pacing the room. Her bare feet left slight paint smudges on the hardwood floors our great-grandfather had installed himself, according to family legend. So what do? There must be something. We need to look at everything. Every transaction, every contract. And we need to talk to Mark. He won't like that. Fear crept into her voice. He's very protective of his business practices. I'm sure he is. I tried to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. But he's going to talk to me. Because if he doesn't, my next call will be to the SEC. Catherine's eyes widened. You wouldn't. To protect our family? Our home? Yes, I would. I moved to the window, looking out over the estate's grounds. Thomas was already at work in the garden, his familiar figure providing a strange comfort. This isn't just about your art anymore, Catherine. This is about our legacy. Everything Mom and Dad built, everything their parents built before them. I never meant. She stopped, swallowing hard. I just wanted them to be proud of me too. The simple honesty in her voice made my chest ache. How many times had I seen that same longing in her eyes growing up? While I collected academic awards and Dad's approving nods, Catherine had drifted from interest to interest, seeking something, anything, that would make them look at her the way they looked at me. They are proud of you, I said finally. But pride won't save the estate. We need to face this head-on, together. She nodded slowly, then squared her shoulders, a gesture so like our mother's it almost made me smile. What do you need me to do? First, we need all the gallery's records. Everything. And then, I paused, knowing my next words would hurt. We need to tell Mom and Dad the whole truth. About Mark, about the gallery's real financial situation, all of it. It'll break their hearts. Better broken hearts than broken lives. I looked around the studio, my old study, seeing it with new eyes. The passion in Catherine's work was undeniable, even if the business behind it was built on sand. Maybe after all this is sorted out, we can find a way to support your art that doesn't risk everything else. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, reminding us that the rest of the household would be waking soon. Catherine moved to her easel, touching the blank canvas gently. I really thought I'd finally found my place, she whispered. My purpose. Your purpose isn't defined by Mark Bradley or the gallery, I said firmly. But right now, we need to focus on saving our home. Are you with me? She met my eyes, and for the first time in years, I saw my sister instead of a rival. Yes, she said. I'm with you. As the morning sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the paint-splattered floor, we began to plan. The road ahead would be difficult, full of hard conversations and harder decisions. But standing there with Catherine, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. Maybe this crisis, as painful as it was, could heal wounds I'd thought were permanent. The estate had always been more than just a house. It was our history, our foundation. And now it would become something else, the ground where two sisters learned to work together instead of against each other. That evening, Catherine and I called a family meeting in the dining room. We'd spent the day gathering evidence, making calls, and piecing together the full extent of Mark Bradley's manipulation. The more we discovered, the clearer it became that he had deliberately taken advantage of both Catherine's artistic dreams and our father's blind spots. Martha had set out coffee and Dad's favorite bourbon, sensing the gravity of the situation. Mom sat at her usual place, nervously arranging and rearranging her silverware. Dad stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames as if they held answers. The portrait of our grandfather, the original William Winchester, watched over us from above the mantel, his stern expression oddly fitting for what was to come. "I suppose you've both found out everything," Dad said finally, not turning from the fire. "About the loans, the gallery." "Not everything," I replied, spreading the documents across the polished mahogany table. "But enough to know we're in serious trouble." "Trouble?" Mom looked between us, her perfectly manicured hands clutching her coffee cup. "What do you mean?" "Catherine's art career is flourishing. The gallery's last opening was in all the local papers." Catherine stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly. "The gallery's been lying, Mom. Mark's been lying. About everything." Over the next hour, we laid it all out. The fraudulent sales reports, the missing funds, the way Mark had convinced Dad to sign over increasing control of the estate's finances, using Catherine's success as bait. With each revelation, Mom's face grew paler, and Dad seemed to age before our eyes. "But the paintings that sold," Mom protested weakly. "Mrs. Carmichael bought them at a fraction of the reported price," Catherine finished. "Mark was inflating the sales figures to justify more investments. She swallowed hard. He even had people bid up the prices at auctions, then cancel the sales later. It was all a show." "Why?" Mom turned to Dad, her voice rising. "Why would you let this happen? All those years of careful management, of building our legacy. Because I wanted to believe in her." Dad burst out, finally turning to face us. His face was flushed, his usual composure shattered. All these years, watching Catherine struggle to find her place while Elizabeth soared. "I thought if I just gave her enough support, enough resources." "You thought throwing money at me would fix everything?" Catherine's voice cracked. "Did you ever actually look at my work, Dad? Or did you just write checks because it was easier than admitting I wasn't Elizabeth?" The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Outside, rain had begun to fall, drumming against the windows like nature's own commentary on our family drama. I looked, Dad said quietly. "Your work, it's beautiful, Catherine. Different from anything I understood, but beautiful. I wanted to give you the same advantages I gave your sister. The same chance to succeed. But it wasn't the same," I interjected, keeping my voice calm despite the emotion churning inside. "You gave me an education, guidance, mentorship. You taught me the value of hard work and due diligence. But with Catherine," I gestured to the documents, "you just threw money at the problem and trusted a stranger to handle the details." Mom stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is my fault too," she said, surprising us all. "I was so busy playing the perfect society mother, bragging about both my daughters, the brilliant lawyer and the artistic genius. I never looked past the surface either." Catherine moved to her side, taking her hand. "Mom, no. You always supported my art. You came to every showing, hung my first paintings. But I didn't ask the hard questions," Mom interrupted. "About the gallery, about Mark, about where the money was coming from. I just wanted you to be happy, to find your place in the world. We all failed," Dad said heavily, sinking into his chair. "And now we might lose everything because of it." "Not everything," I said firmly, pulling out my laptop. "Not if we act quickly. I've been running numbers all day. If we liquidate certain investments, restructure the loans, and most importantly, Cut ties with Mark Bradley immediately. He won't like that, Catherine warned. He's got contracts, agreements. Fraudulent agreements, I corrected. Which brings me to the next part. I opened my email, showing them the message I'd drafted. This goes to the SEC first thing tomorrow morning, unless Mark agrees to our terms. Dad leaned forward, reading quickly. His eyebrows rose. Elizabeth, this is aggressive. It's protective, I countered. We have evidence of fraud, misappropriation of funds, and possible tax evasion. Mark can either work with us to unwind this mess cleanly, or he can deal with a federal investigation. You'd really do that? Catherine asked softly. Turn him in. To protect our family? In a heartbeat. I met her eyes. But I'm hoping it won't come to that. People like Mark Bradley prefer to cut their losses and run when confronted. Especially if we offer him a way to do it quietly. Mom wiped her eyes, leaving slight smudges in her perfect makeup. What do we do now? How do we fix this? Together, I said, reaching for Catherine's hand across the table. First, we meet with Mark tomorrow. Catherine, you'll need to be there. He needs to see that you're with us on this. She nodded, squeezing my hand. I'm done being his puppet. The art world will still be there after we sort this out. William? Mom turned to Dad. Are you ready to face this? Dad stood up slowly, walking to the family portrait over the fireplace. I spent so many years trying to live up to my father's legacy, he said, staring up at the stern face above. Trying to build something worthy of the Winchester name. And in the process, I nearly destroyed it. Not destroyed, I corrected gently. Just dented. We can fix this, Dad. But we need you clear-headed and focused. No more blind trust, no more looking the other way. He turned back to us, and for the first time, I saw real determination in his eyes. Tell me what you need me to do. As the rain continued to fall outside, we gathered around the dining table, not as separate individuals pursuing our own paths, but as a family facing a crisis together. Catherine and I sat side by side, our childhood rivalry forgotten in the face of a real threat. Mom's perfect society mask had cracked, revealing the fierce protector underneath. And Dad, finally forced to confront his mistakes, seemed somehow stronger in his vulnerability. The grandfather clock struck midnight as we finished our planning. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the confrontation with Mark, the hard work of financial recovery, the long process of rebuilding trust. But sitting there in the warm light of the dining room, surrounded by generations of family portraits and centuries of history, I felt something I hadn't expected: gratitude. This crisis, painful as it was, had forced us to see each other clearly for the first time in years. We weren't just the roles we'd been playing: the successful lawyer, the struggling artist, the society mother, the distant father. We were the Winchesters, and together, we would find our way through this storm. The meeting with Mark Bradley went exactly as I'd predicted. When faced with the evidence of his fraud and the threat of federal investigation, his carefully cultivated art world persona crumbled. We sat in the gallery's back office, Catherine, Dad, and me, watching him sign the paperwork that would sever his connection to our family's finances. His hands shook, but he didn't argue. "You could have been great," he said to Catherine as he handed over the final document. "Your work has real potential." "My work will be great on its own terms," she replied, her voice steady. "Without the fake sales and inflated prices. Without you." That was 2 months ago. Now, standing on the mansion's east balcony in the early morning light, I could finally see the changes we'd made taking shape. The estate's grounds stretched out below me, the gardens showing the first signs of spring. Thomas was teaching his grandson Joey the proper way to prune roses, a new generation learning the old ways. Inside, the house was slowly transforming. Catherine had moved her studio to the conservatory, where the natural light was actually better for painting. My old study was returning to its original purpose, though we'd kept one wall for her artwork, a reminder that change didn't have to mean erasure. Morning. Catherine appeared beside me, 2 coffee cups in hand. She passed me one, the rich aroma of our favorite blend rising in the cool air. "Mom's looking for you." "Something about the charity board meeting?" I nodded, taking a sip. "They want me to join." Apparently, my financial acumen would be an asset. She laughed. Look at you, joining the society circuit. Next thing you know, you'll be organizing garden parties. Only if you promise to shock everyone with your avant-garde sculptures. The easy banter between us still felt new, but no longer strange. Working together to save the estate had broken down walls we'd built over decades. We discovered that my organizational skills and her creative thinking could actually complement each other, rather than clash. The sound of a car on the gravel driveway drew our attention. Dad's Mercedes pulled up, returning from his morning meeting at Goldman & Associates. The restructuring of our finances was almost complete, thanks to a combination of careful negotiation and strategic planning. We'd had to sell some assets, but the core of the estate, the mansion and its grounds, was secure. How do you think it went? Catherine asked, watching Dad step out of the car. Look at his walk, I said, noting his straight shoulders and quick stride. That's his good news posture. She bumped my shoulder playfully. Trust the lawyer to read body language. Trust the artist to ignore the obvious clue. He's carrying celebration bagels from Morton's. We met him in the kitchen, where Mom was already setting out plates and cream cheese. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the silver in Dad's hair and the laugh lines around Mom's eyes. They looked younger somehow, lighter, since we'd faced our crisis together. The bank's happy with our progress, Dad announced, distributing the bagels. James Goldman specifically mentioned how impressed he was with our transparency and organization. He smiled at me. Having a corporate lawyer in the family certainly helped. Having an honest assessment of our assets helped more, I corrected, including Catherine's legitimate art sales. Because that had been the surprise in all this. Once freed from Mark's manipulative influence, Catherine's work had found its own audience. Smaller shows, more intimate galleries, but real sales to people who genuinely connected with her vision. She was building a reputation slowly, authentically, supported by our family's encouragement rather than our bank account. Speaking of assets, Mom said, pulling out a folder. I've been thinking about the East Wing. Now that we're more financially conscious, it seems silly to heat and maintain all those empty rooms. What are you suggesting? I asked, though I could see where this was going. An art school, Catherine burst out, unable to contain her excitement. Just a small one, mind you. Weekend classes, maybe some evening workshops. Mom thinks we could use the space to help local artists who can't afford formal training. The tuition would help offset the maintenance costs, Mom added practically. And it would put all that space to good use. I looked at Dad, who nodded. We've run the numbers. It's actually quite viable, especially with the tax benefits of registering as an educational institution. Look at you, talking tax benefits, I teased. Someone's been paying attention during our financial reviews. Yes, well, he cleared his throat. Recent events have taught me the value of understanding the details. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, reminding me I had a video call with my New York office in an hour. I'd been managing to balance my corporate law practice with the family's needs, thanks to modern technology and understanding colleagues. Some of my clients had even become interested in Catherine's art, proving that our different worlds could intersect in unexpected ways. I should head to the study, I said, gathering my coffee cup. But first, what do you all think about dinner tonight? There's something I want to discuss. Uh-oh, Catherine grinned. Sounds serious. It is, actually. I took a deep breath. I've been offered a partnership at a firm here in Boston. Same corporate law, but closer to home. The kitchen fell silent. Mom's hand found Dad's, squeezing gently. You'd move back. Catherine asked softly, what about your life in New York? New York was where I proved myself, I said. But home is where I found myself again. Besides, I smiled at her. Someone needs to keep an eye on the family finances. And the family artist? She asked, her eyes twinkling. That too. As I headed to the study, I paused in the hallway, looking at the family portraits that had witnessed so much drama. The stern faces of our ancestors seemed less judgmental now, more like silent guardians who had watched our family weather its storms and emerge stronger. In my study, our study really, since Catherine still kept a small easel in the corner, the morning sun illuminated the desk where I'd first discovered the extent of our troubles. The same light now showed the path forward: financial statements showing recovery, class schedules for the new art school, and a preliminary contract from the Boston law firm. The mansion creaked and settled around me, its familiar sounds no longer echoing with loss and resentment, but with possibility. We'd nearly lost everything, but in the process, we'd found something more valuable: a way to honor both the past and the future, to blend tradition with innovation, to be a family that celebrated our differences instead of letting them divide us. Outside my window, I could see Thomas and Joey finishing their work in the rose garden. Catherine had set up her easel on the lawn, capturing the scene in her distinctive style. Mom and Dad walked the grounds arm in arm, their heads close together as they discussed plans for the art school. The estate was more than just a mansion now. It had become what it was always meant to be: a home where every member of our family could thrive in their own way, supported by the foundation of our shared history and strengthened by the challenges we'd overcome together. I opened my laptop, ready to face the day's work. The future we were building might not look exactly like the one our ancestors had envisioned, but I had a feeling they would approve. After all, the Winchester legacy wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about adapting, growing, and finding new ways to define success. Together, we had transformed a crisis into an opportunity and a house into a home. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them as we had faced this one, as a family, each contributing our unique strengths to write the next chapter in our shared story.